ahead and get started. The first item on our agenda today is to approve the minutes sent out yesterday and this morning for January 12th, 20th, 21st, March 10th, March 16th, February 10th, February 11th, March 17th, and March 18th. You all had a chance to review that. I haven't heard back for any changes, and I need a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Representative Clayton, seconded by Representative Highland. Any discussion? Seeing none. Oh, you can close.
I close.
All right, so all in favor of the committee, you've heard the motion, seconded by Representative Highland. All in favor of the motion, say aye. All against, say no. Motion passes. Future minutes, as they come out, they'll be sent to you because this is probably going to be our last meeting for the year in here. And you'll just have a time period to get back to us. If you don't get back to us in that time period, they'll automatically be approved. With that, we've got 3 bills that we would like to try to discuss today. I'm going to start with HB 2443. That is the employment preference for persons of disability. And with a motion on HB 2443, Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the committee pass 2443 out favorably.
Can you get a second? Seconded by Representative Dodson. Discussion on the bill, Representative Clayton.
Thank you, committee. I have an amendment. I would like to rename this bill Kathy's bill. That's Kathy with a K. I've sent that correct spelling to Charles. And this is after Kathy Lobb, who has continued to advocate for the state of Kansas to hire more individuals with disabilities for more than 20 years. You will note in your testimony that a number of conferees made this request, and I ask for your consideration.
Seconded by Representative Burrows. Any discussion on that amendment? Seeing none, you can close. Committee, you've all heard the motion, seconded by Representative Burrows. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All against, say no. Motion passes. Any Representative Sutton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did we ever receive any confirmation that this was an executive order that had been in place for several years? That was my understanding, but it didn't seem like we had a real good answer on that during the hearing.
I don't know that we've received an answer back on that, but that is my understanding as well.
All right, thank you.
Betty, were you able to look into that by any chance?
Mr. Chair, I've found one that seems to have been created in 2015 under Governor Brownback. I have not found any that got rid of that hiring preference from then. But I also haven't clearly found any reauthorizations, but this one doesn't seem to include an immediate sunset with the termination of the administration. So it might be one that has continued in effect since that time. So and the executive order isn't maybe necessarily as clearly specific as the bill, but it is in the same vein.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Is that good enough for you, Representative?
It is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion on this bill? Seeing none, Representative, you can close.
I close.
Committee, you've heard the motion, seconded by Representative Dodson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All against, say no. Motion passes. Committee, draw your attention to Senate Bill 91. That's 91. That is the Senate bill that transfers the HPIP tax credit. If you recall, we moved that language into the other HPIP kit Kerr bill. So this is available for use. So with a motion on SB 91, Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee pass out SB 91 favorable for passage.
Need a second? Representative Sutton seconds it. And I have an amendment. I want to, Charles, I want to take the contents of HB 2442 and move, I want to strike the contents of SB 91 and move the contents of HB 2442 into SB 91. HB 2442 committee is the transfer of liability from businesses to schools for workplace learning. And then we can have Charles go through the contents of HB 2442 and give us an explanation of what that bill does.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. HB 2442, as the committee will recall, regards high school work-based learning programs. The bill provides for protection from liability for businesses that accept secondary students into a work-based learning program. If business is defined very broadly in the bill, and it also includes, in addition to regular business entities, it would include cities, counties, townships, law enforcement departments, fire departments, public universities, municipal universities, community colleges, technical colleges, and also not-for-profit private post-secondary educational institutions. And also not-for-profit organizations. If a school district has purchased insurance coverage, then a business that accepts a secondary student would not be subject to civil liability for claims for bodily injury to a student that is participating in the work-based learning program. If the school has purchased insurance, the business would also not be liable for claims arising from the student's negligent act or omission during the student's participation in the work-based learning program. The second part of the bill makes some changes to a couple of statutes that are currently in the law. It just provides that boards of education may purchase insurance contracts for school-sponsored activities as current law, and then it adds that school-sponsored activities are going to include travel provided by the school to and from or participation in a work-based learning program. Those changes are on page 2 of the bill with respect to 2 statutes that pertain to the ability of boards of education to purchase insurance. And that is what the bill does.
Thank you, Charles. In committee, we made 2 changes from the original version of this bill. The school boards had a problem with if a business transported one of these students, they didn't want to be responsible for that. And so we had that removed in the rewrite of this bill. We also redefined the workplace or the school activity definition so that we didn't disrupt the other definitions of school liability current statute, and it also made it so that the insurance policies could respond. Any discussion on that, on this amendment to move the contents into SB 91? Second on that. Seconded by Representative Hoffman. Seeing no discussion, I'll close on the amendment to move to strike the contents of SB 91 and replace it with the contents of HB 2442. Committee, you've heard the motion, seconded by Representative Hoffman. All in favor say aye. Aye. All against say no. Motion passes. Is there any discussion on SB 91? Seeing no discussion, Representative, you can close. The question arises, Eddie, do we need a motion to substitute for SB 91, or do we need just to, as amended?
That would probably be a better question for Charles than me, but I imagine it's whatever is the pleasure of the committee Charles could work with, but might want to check with him.
Chairman, I would say that, yeah, I would agree with Eddie that, I can work with what the committee decides. I think as amended, but would be fine.
I think it'd be cleaner. I think I'm being told by a few committee members that I think it'll be cleaner just to make a substitute bill for SB 91, and that it'd be passed favorably.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee pass out House substitute for Senate Bill 91 favorable.
Committee, you heard the motion seconded by Representative Hoffman. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All against, say no. Motion passes. With that, committee, I'll draw your attention to HB 2328. That is the aviation tax credit bill. And we'll get a description of the bill from the reviser, Charles Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 2328, as the committee will recall, it provides certain tax credits for both businesses and for employees in those businesses in the aviation sector. It provides for two tax credits for businesses. One, for if a business reimburses tuition that is paid by a qualified employee, there's a tax credit for that. Also, the compensation paid for a business to a qualified employee, there is a tax credit for that as provided by the bill. There are limitations in the bill with respect to those tax credits. The third tax credit the bill provides, as the committee will recall, is for the qualified employee, and that is a tax credit for $5,000. That there's finally there is a reporting provision in the bill on page 3 that the Secretary of Revenue is to report to House Committee on Appropriations and Senate Committee on Ways and Means on information regarding the cost and effectiveness of the tax credit programs. And that is a very brief summary of what the bill does.
Any question for the reviser on what the bill does? See none. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. For discussion on HB 2328, Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee pass out HB 2328 favorably.
Second, Representative Dodson. Discussion on HB 2328, Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just urge the passage and support of this bill. It's not only important for Kansas, but it's also very important to our skilled trade workers. And so thank you for your indulgence and hope that you support.
I do have an amendment on here, and I believe Cindy has sent it to you. It's a simple amendment that says that the bill currently does not say you need to live in Kansas, and we just wanted to make that clear. We want them to be purchasing homes and spending their money and paying property tax in Kansas. And so I need a second on that. Representative Burrows. Is there any discussion on that? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and close. Committee, you heard the motion. Seconded by Representative Burrows. All in favor say aye. Aye. All against say no. No. Motion passes. Is there any further discussion on HB 2328? Representative Auerkamp?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment, and no, Cindy has it yesterday afternoon.
We'll pause while Cindy sends that to you. Representative, you want to explain your amendment, or do you want to have Charles do it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If Charles was willing to explain it, then I can give a quick reason why. Great. Thank you.
Chairman, members of the committee, this amendment provides an alternative tax credit in the event that the qualified employee has not paid for tuition. So in a situation where the qualified employee does not have tuition expenses that the business has reimbursed, so the business can claim the tax credit. This provides for a tax credit for school expenses for a qualified employee. These expenses are for one or more children to attend a private school that has been reimbursed. Those expenses have been reimbursed by the employer. The credit is just as similar to the tuition credit. It's in an amount equal to 50% of the qualified educational expenses reimbursed during the taxable year for which the credit is claimed. In no event shall the credit exceed 50% of the average annual amount paid for qualified educational expenses for private schools as determined by the Secretary of Revenue. The credit is applied against businesses' income tax liability after all other credits allowed under the Income Tax Act, and the credit is not refundable and may not be carried forward. So very similar to the current tuition tax credit for businesses, tuition that has been reimbursed for businesses in the bill, just that this is for expenses paid for school. And there is some added definitions. Private schools defined on page 2 of the amendment as any accredited private school located in Kansas that provides education to elementary or secondary students. Qualified educational expenses is defined there on the top of page 2 as the costs of an education at a private school, including tuition, fees, or expenses charged by a private school, and if applicable, the cost of transportation to a private school if provided by such school. And that is what this amendment would do.
Representative, you want to explain the amendment?
Just to add on after, I think Charles gave the explanation of what the contents are, as far as the reason why, if we're offering this bill as a tool to help businesses attract talent, there probably are situations where the employee does not have any college tuition obligations, and this would simply allow the business another tool to use to attract these talented individuals to their business. And it's also something I've been curious about. I know a lot of parents do take their children's education seriously to where they will move, whether talking to people down in Wichita or Kansas City, Lawrence, Topeka, out of state. It does matter a lot to them. And this is a tool that I'd be curious how much it gets used, Mr. Chairman. So with that, happy to stand for questions.
I've got a question for you. So the way this reads, the business has to pay for the tuition, and then the business gets a tax credit, not unlike if they were paying off their tuition, if they had some. The student loan.
If I may, Charles, please correct me, but I think the employee pays the tuition and the business reimburses that employee. I read that correctly.
Okay, so if a business reimburses an employee for tuition and fees for K through 12 school, they would get the business would get a 50% tax credit for that.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And they don't have to pay for the whole ride, right? They gave them $1,000, they would get a $500 tax credit.
That's how I read it. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And is this in addition to the other tax credits, or only if they don't qualify for the tuition reimbursement?
It's an alternative.
Charles, can you answer that?
Sorry, Charles, that was my bad. You need to unmute.
Chairman, members of the committee. So this tax credit is set up very similar to the tax credit currently in the bill for reimbursement for tuition. It's a credit for the employer if the employer reimburses the employee for the qualified educational expenses. And as I noted, those are defined at the top of page 2. This is for expenses for a private school. Those are also, private schools also defined at the top of page 2. So if the employee has these qualified educational expenses at a school, at a private school, and the employee pays for them, and the business reimburses the employee, then the business is entitled to that 50% of the qualified educational expenses that the business reimbursed during the taxable year to the employee. So it's very similar to the current tax credit for tuition that's in the bill. It's an alternative to that tax credit in the event that the employee does not have tuition expenses that a business may reimburse for a tax credit, but the employee has costs for their child or children going to a private school. The business would be able to obtain a tax credit for reimbursing the employee for those expenses.
Okay, so it's not one or the other, it's if they do not have tuition for reimbursement or student loans for reimbursement, then they could opt into this.
That's correct, Chairman. The way that the amendment is currently worded is reimbursement to a qualified employee who has not paid tuition that may be reimbursed for the tax credit that's already in the bill.
Okay. Any questions, Representative Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do like this amendment, but I do have a question on it. So if you had 3 children, they were elementary school children, and let's say their tuition's $5,000 a year, so it's $15,000 total, would that employer be able to get a tax, and the employer decides to cover the full amount, if that's allowable, if I'm reading it right, then they would get a $7,500 tax credit? Is there any limit to what they can give to for reimbursement purposes?
I would defer to Charles that, but I think that the cap is still the same. And it's not a additional amount other than what's already previously in the bill.
Okay, but the credit's 50% of the cost, but is there a cap on how much they can reimburse that employee for the school? So say they go to a collegiate and they pay $16,000 a year. I guess it's based on how much their salary is. They have a certain, if I'm making any sense at all. Charles?
Yes, Representative. So similar to how the tuition credit is set up, there's a limitation of the 50%. But I think the way, the 50% average as determined by the Secretary of Revenue. But there would not be a limit other than that. So the way the amendment is currently written, there would be that 50% limitation with respect to each child. I think is how it would be currently. If you look at the amendment, page 3, the balloon there in subsection C. So that's going to be the limitation. And I think the way it's written, it would be to each child. So if you have 3 children, it would be 50%. That 50% limitation would apply to each of those children, but there wouldn't be a total limit.
Okay, so it's 50% credit for each child, so they get 50% of their tuition reimbursed. Is that correct?
Yes, and then, yes,
And then the-
Representative, and then, I'm sorry.
And then the employer takes that amount and that's their credit?
Representative, the credit would be 50% of the educational expenses reimbursed during the taxable year. And except that there's that limit that it's not to exceed 50% of the average annual amount paid for qualified educational expenses for private schools as determined by the Secretary of Revenue. So there's that limitation, just like with the tuition credit.
I will think about that. Thank you.
So, Representative, I think the trigger is the company has to the company has to reimburse the employee. So if they didn't want to reimburse them for the full tuition, they could give them to say $2,500 towards reimbursement, and then they would get a 50% tax credit for that. Further discussion, Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, my stars, I didn't think we'd be debating light vouchers today in commerce. I, was on education last session, but here we are. I've got some concerns about the potential cost for this, and I do apologize, Representative. We've been having such a good session where we've been getting along, but I'm afraid that I'm going to have to diverge from you on this issue. So any thoughts that you have about the potential cost?
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Representative. No, as far as the potential cost, however, if a student goes through a public K through 12, there's a certain cost to the state with regards to the public education cost, right? So if the same student goes to a non-public school, the state does not absorb that cost. And it's potentially the use of a tax credit, which is probably very similar to the cost of educating a child in the K through 12 system. So I'm just taking a guess. I would imagine it's either a net zero or there might even be some savings for the state.
Could someone use this if you were a business owner and you were employed by your own company? Because I gotta say that might be potentially sketch.
I would defer to the definition of a qualified employee. And if a business owner would fall under the definition of a qualified employee, which I would find it difficult to do that, then it would apply, but I don't see that actually being the case.
Granted, these are recent graduates.
Mm-hmm. So, committee, I do rise in opposition to this amendment. I think that this is a good bill. This is very important to the state and to Sedgwick County in particular. So I do ask that you oppose this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further discussion, Representative Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of my questions of many I might have is this governed by the same 5-year time limit that applies to the other tax credits?
The bill sunsets in 5 years.
I understand, but as the tax credits for tuition and the $5,000 individual income tax credit, it looks like those are you can take those for 5 taxable years. Is this governed by that, or is this a continuous ongoing tax credit?
Charles, you want to answer that? Or Representative Auerkamp?
So, I mean, the provision in the bill that no new credit shall be issued or may be earned under the provisions of, under the other, with respect to the other tax credits also apply to this tax credit. And that's on page 4 of the balloon. You can see that we're adding number 5 into section 6 there.
So let's suppose that we do what we do and we come back 5 years from now and renew this whole program. The way I understand it, if I've taken 5 years of credit, I'm done. If I take that $5,000 individual tax credit And if I've taken advantage of the 15,000 credit, I'm done taking the tax, even if we extend this program for 20 years. My question is, if I have a 5-year-old going into school and I take advantage of this tax credit, and 5 years from now we renew this bill and extend that sunset, will I be able to take for another 5 years this tax credit?
Charles, you're on mute again.
My apologies, Chairman. This tax credit is like the tuition tax credit currently in the bill, is for the employer. It's for only the taxable year in which it's claimed. It can't be carried forward. It's not refundable, and it can only be applied after all the employer's other liability, after all other credits allowed under the Income Tax Act, just as with the credit for tuition that's currently in the bill. So there isn't really an inherent time limitation that I can recall from looking at the bill. There is a time limitation with respect to the employer's credit for compensation paid to a qualified employee. That you can find on page 3. You can look at the balloon on page 3, lines, let's see, line 25 on page 3. But there isn't with respect to the tuition, with respect to the school credit, there isn't any other specific limitation.
I just want to make sure I understand. For this section that's being proposed, there's no time limitation. Outside of the sunset, I acknowledge the sunset. Outside of the sunset, which will probably extend as we do, for this provision, there's no timetable. There's no time restriction.
The way it is currently drafted, no.
Charles, is there a limit on the tuition reimbursement or the student loan reimbursement tax credit? Can they say somebody owed $100,000 and the company paid their tuition at, say, a couple of $1,000s a year? Is there a limit to number of years they can make a payment towards the towards the student loans?
Yes, Chairman. If you look at page 2 of the bill, lines 32 to 37, there is a limitation that the credit may be claimed each year that the employee remains employed up to the 4th year of employment. So if the committee wanted to add a provision exactly similar to that to the school credit, that certainly that could be done.
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Charles, on page 3 of the balloon, it just reads, as an alternative to the tax credit provided by section 2, does that bring in some of the elements of the tax credit in section 2? So the same, I guess, time limitation would apply and same restrictions as far as maintaining employment?
Representative, that's certainly a possible interpretation. I think if we wanted to be clear, it would probably be good to just move over just that same language, if the committee wants to do that, just that same language from the tuition credit that's already in the bill. We could just add on page 2, line, trying to find what line I was there. Line 36 on page 2 and line 37. So that would not be a problem to do that. But to be clear, to make the tax credit clear, that should probably be done. Although it would be reasonable to, as you state, to think that some of those would come along.
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was the intention, is not to go beyond the current college or technical education tuition credit. Is just follow the same guidelines, the same rules, and be able to offer just another tool to the businesses to attract employees.
Charles, can you make that tweak to that amendment? That it was, the intent was to match the same time period as the repayment of tuition?
Certainly, Chairman, that would not be a problem.
Okay. Representative Probst, you still have the floor.
Thank you. So now we're going to look at putting the same 5-year cap on this provision as we have elsewhere in the bill. Am I understanding that right? Okay.
I think it's maybe 4. Is that right, Charles?
I believe the way the language is worded, if the committee wants to look at the balloon, trying to find the line again. Page 2, discussing the tuition tax credit. Line 36 and 37 of page 2 of the balloon. So it's the credit is for the first year, and then each year thereafter that the qualified employee remains employed up to the 4th year of employment.
Does that make 4 or 5?
I guess up to the 4th year, so that would be 4. I apologize, 4.
Okay, Representative Probst.
Okay, so now I'm going to go to the other side of this, and if I've claimed this tax credit, maybe I have 3 kids, and I've claimed the tax credit for 4 years. That's not applicable to any of my other children. Maybe I've got younger children, and I'd like to be able to take that tax credit for them. I want to make sure that it stays to the employee. So maybe the first kid gets 4 nice years of private school, and the others are kind of left out in the dark. It just sticks to the employee. It doesn't apply to each individual child. Am I understanding that correctly?
The tax credit is the company's for reimbursement of tuition expense for the employee for up to 4 years.
Okay. I'm just going to say one more thing. I really wish that we wouldn't mix issues. This is a good provision. We've been trying to get this done for a long time. Sedgwick County's been asking for it. The industry's been asking for it. I think it's probably not in the best interest of the bill to start pulling in what I think we could all agree is a relatively controversial topic into a tax program that we're building to try to recruit people to the state. We have a tuition reimbursement. If they don't have children, they're still going to benefit from, if they don't have tuition expense or they don't have children, they're still going to benefit from this income tax provision. So I wish that we would not do this. I suspect that we will.
Representative Shue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Probst stole most of my thunder there, but I agree. This is a pretty large expansion of what I think is a great underlying idea, and that's providing tuition reimbursement for aviation employees by aviation companies. Opening this up to lots of children as well, I think is just a huge, huge expansion of, in my opinion, the intent. So yeah, I also wish we would not mix these issues. Thank you.
Representative Carpenter, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee. I appreciate bringing this amendment. I just think that there has been a lot of work done on this bill. It's very important. I think a new subsection 3 at this point in time would substantially destroy some of the main parts of the aviation bill. So, but along with that, I have a question here. In new section 3, section C at the bottom, it says qualified educational expenses for private schools as determined by the Secretary of Revenue. My question is, does the Secretary of Revenue have that ability to know what 50% of the annual average amount paid for qualified educational expenses in private schools information.
There's similar, if I may, Mr. Chairman,
Representative Auerkamp.
there's similar language for tuition at the colleges or technical schools. And so I think the same approach would be taken to that as to the K through 12 expenses as well. You'd have to just take a look at whatever data is available for the college institutions or technical colleges and probably find the same group of data for K through 12 and make a judgment call.
I kind of understand that, but this is private schools, and they vary so widely in their tuition. I'm not sure you could find that figure. Thank you.
Representative Auerkamp, maybe it would be wise to put some sort of tuition limit per kid on this so that we're not worried about the intricacies of whether or not the Department of Revenue knows and how much can be reimbursed.
Mr. Chairman, if you think that would help the amendment, yes, I would support that. And I think it could be a very helpful tool for the businesses to attract talent, and especially if there's a concern that it would be used quite a bit. I think that's a clear sign that it would be a very helpful tool for these businesses. And so if that would help the amendment, yes, Mr. Chairman, I would support that. You have an amount that you would like to see in there?
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know there's several different parts for it, there's the employee, there's the employer. So Chuck, is the 15,000 annual limit, would that apply? Or is that entirely different, or could we use that?
A representative, the $15,000 limit you see on page 3 of the balloon at line 11, that would only be applicable with respect to the credit for the employer for compensation paid to the employee. But if you wanted to use 15,000, certainly that would,
Representative Auerkamp.
In the balloon, Mr. Chairman, as far as putting a cap on the credit, would $4,000, a cap of $4,000 on the tax credit for the K through 12 education be something that you would consider?
I think that may help the amendment, and it certainly, if a company were to pay up to $8,000 for the tuition reimbursement, they would get a tax credit of $4,000. And I think that would get a good start anyway into most private schools. Is that something you want to do?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we don't have a second on the amendment yet, so. Representative Highland. Oh, I mean, did you have a question? I have you on the list.
I think we answered my question. I was confused by what Charles said. The $15,000 annual for each qualified employee, you're saying that applies to the employer. And I'm reading that as the max for employee, or employee. So am I reading it wrong or right?
Representative, I guess I was referring to the credit for compensation that paid to a qualified employee. And I thought that was what Representative Williams was referencing on page 3 of the balloon, line 11. That $15,000 is the limit for each qualified employee. And this is a credit for the employer for compensation paid to the qualified employee. And There is, I don't believe there's another, that $15,000 limit just applies to that particular credit, that credit to the employer for compensation paid to the employee.
Representative, if they paid a new employee $200,000, 10% of that would be 20,000, so the max they would be able to get would be 15. That's what that limit is for.
Okay. And then the second question then, after this expires, this bill goes away, there's nothing in here that precludes that employer from continuing these gifts for tuition and or whatever is amended on here. They can still do what they want. They just no longer receive any of the tax credits. Is that right? We're not telling them they can't do it.
I'd say that's correct.
Okay.
Representative Dodson.
I'd like to return to the basics here. This is a aviation-related bill. You go down to the bottom of page 1 and read about institution. It's talking about community colleges, technical college, and so on. Go over about halfway down, it's actually current item H for a qualified program, talking about engineering accreditation commission and so on. And then you look at new F. New F says provides education to elementary or secondary students. I'm trying to find the connection. I mean, you can expect someone who is 17 or 18 to be a prospective employee, I think, but I'm not sure getting someone in a private school that's also accredited by engineering institution to be an employee is credible. So, I mean, I guess I'm echoing what a lot of folks have said. I just think this is disconnected from the bill that we're trying to pass here that is oriented towards more real-time support for aviation in Wichita.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, may I call the question? Is that in order?
Call the question is in order, and it's a non-debatable motion. Eddie, you want to explain that, please?
The motion to call the question would end debate immediately and force an immediate vote on the underlying motion. The only question I did have is there a second on the underlying motion at this point?
We do not have a second on the underlying motion yet.
Then I don't actually know that the committee truly has a question before it, upon which the question may be called.
My apologies. I thought that.
Representative Highland seconds the motion. Now you can call the question.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I call the question.
Okay, so you've heard the motion, second by Representative Highland. All in favor, say aye. All against, say no.
No.
Noes appear to have it. Those do have it. Further discussion on HB 2328. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually rise in support of this, and here is why. It doesn't relate to those grade schoolers that maybe want to go to work as an engineer. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do.
The amendment failed.
No. The amendment was for her motion to call the question.
Call the question, takes a vote on the question.
Right, on the question, the question failed.
It was the amendment.
No. That's the vote. You have to vote on the question.
Eddie, do you want to?
You have to vote on the question before you can go to the amendment. You can't just vote on the amendment. You first have to pass that.
My
Point of order.
understanding comports with Representative Williams is that a vote should have been taken on whether to call the previous question, and that is non-debatable. If that vote passes, then debate on the amendment immediately ceases and a vote is immediately taken upon the amendment. If the motion to call the previous question does not pass, debate resumes on the underlying amendment.
Okay, well, that was my mistake then. We'll take a vote on the call to question.
Well, isn't that what we did?
No.
So people didn't understand.
Yes, so that was my fault, point of order, and we'll take a vote on whether or not to call a question.
I move that we call the question. A yes vote allows us to call the question.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All against, say no. The chair's in question. All in favor, raise your hand.
Don't forget me. I'm voting.
We got you, Representative Ruiz.
All right.
All against, say no. Raise your hand. 14-7, motion passes, which means we now have to vote on the amendment with no discussion. Is that correct, Eddie?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so this is on the amendment to add this with a $4,000 limit, matches the 4-year term, and only to be used in the case that there is no underlying repayments to be made for the student loans. So you've heard the motion, seconded by Representative Highland. All in favor for the motion, say aye. All against the motion, say no.
No.
Division's been called. All in favor of the motion, raise your hand. All against the motion, raise your hand. And Representative Ruiz, we see you. Vote of 14-6. Motion fails, and Representative Clayton would like her no vote recorded. Further discussion on HB 2328. That's it. Representative Miller? It has been amended because we made them a Kansas resident. Seconded by Representative Long. Any further discussion? Motion by Representative Miller to pass out favorably as amended, HB 2328, seconded by Representative Long. All in favor, say aye. All against, say no. Motion passes. Okay, committee, that's all we've got for today and possibly for the year, unless something comes up that's crazy. We're done for the year. I really appreciate all the help and all the work that you guys did. If you think about what we accomplished this year, we got 2 years worth of bills really done. Several of them we had to do twice. I see you. Several of them we had to do twice. We've got 2 major pieces of legislation through this committee. One is the long-term fix for the unemployment system, which is something that I think we'll all be able to look back on one day and be pretty proud of, because all these issues that we're having will probably never happen again because of the work you did. Also, we opened up Kansas, or at least we're in the process of opening up Kansas for professionals that want to move here because of that piece of legislation that's close to passing as well. Good work, everybody. I appreciate your patience with me, and I really think we all owe Cindy a big thank you for her hard work. And our researchers and our revisers were extremely busy with this committee, and so they also deserve a big thank you too. Representative Miller,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't care what everybody else is saying. I think you did a great job this year.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. All right, with that, we're adjourned.